I thought turning 70 would be remembered as one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, it became the day I learned exactly what my place was in my own family. The moment my daughter-in-law lifted her champagne glass, smiled at a room full of relatives, and said those words, everything changed. My name is Evelyn Parker, and on the night of my 70th birthday, I sat at the head of a beautifully decorated dining table surrounded by family members who were laughing, eating, and celebrating what was supposed to be a milestone. The dining room glowed with warm light. Fresh flowers filled the center of the table. My grandchildren had helped hang banners across the walls. There was a large birthday cake waiting in the kitchen. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe that I was loved. I allowed myself to believe that all the years of sacrifice, hard work, and devotion to my family had meant something. My husband, Richard, had passed away 5 years earlier, and birthdays had never felt quite the same without him. But that evening, seeing my son Ryan, my daughter-in-law Melissa, my grandchildren, cousins, neighbors, and old friends gathered together made me feel grateful. I remember looking around the room and thinking that Richard would have been proud. Ryan was standing near the fireplace, speaking with relatives. Melissa moved confidently around the room greeting guests. Everyone seemed happy. Everything seemed normal. Then dinner ended. Glasses were filled. The room quieted as Melissa stood from her chair and picked up a champagne flute. I smiled, assuming she was about to say something kind. After all, she had organized most of the celebration. I even felt touched by the effort she had made. She tapped her glass lightly, and everyone turned toward her. A few people smiled. Others lifted their drinks. Melissa looked directly at me. Her smile seemed pleasant enough at first. Then she raised her glass higher and said, "Let us all raise a toast to the old lady who will not have to worry about cooking holiday dinners anymore because she is heading to a nursing home." For a moment, nobody reacted. The room became so quiet that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. Surely I had heard wrong. Surely there was another sentence coming. Some explanation. Some joke that would make the comment less cruel. But nothing came. Melissa stood there smiling. A few nervous laughs escaped from distant corners of the room. Most people simply stared. I felt every eye turned toward me. My hands remained folded in my lap because I was afraid they would shake if I moved them. My heart pounded against my chest. The words echoed through my mind again and again. The old lady going to a nursing home. I looked at Ryan, my own son. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat and looked away. That hurt more than Melissa's comment. If he had immediately stood up and said she was joking, perhaps things would have been different. If he had defended me, perhaps the evening could have been saved. Instead, he stared at the tablecloth. Melissa finally laughed lightly and took a sip from her glass. A few guests forced awkward smiles. The conversation slowly restarted. Yet something had changed. The celebration was gone. The warmth was gone. The room suddenly felt cold despite being crowded with people. I sat there smiling politely because I refused to cry in front of everyone. 70 years of life teaches you many things. One lesson is that public humiliation becomes easier to survive when you stop giving cruel people the reaction they want. So I smiled. I thanked guests for coming. I cut the cake. I posed for photographs. I played the role expected of me while something inside me quietly broke. Throughout the rest of the evening, I noticed things I had ignored before. The way Melissa exchanged glances with certain relatives. The way Ryan seemed anxious whenever the subject of future plans came up. The way several guests avoided looking directly at me after the toast. It was as though everyone knew something I did not. By the time the final guests left, my stomach was tied in knots. The house became quiet. My grandchildren had gone home with relatives. The dishes were stacked in the kitchen. Decorations still hung from the walls. I walked slowly down the hallway toward my bedroom. As I passed the living room, I heard voices. Melissa and Ryan were speaking softly. I was not trying to listen, but my name caught my attention. I stopped. "She cannot stay here forever," Melissa said. "The sooner we handle this, the easier it will be." My chest tightened. Ryan answered so quietly that I could barely hear him. Then Melissa spoke again. "The place has already been selected. Everything is practically ready." Selected. Ready. The word sent a chill through me. I moved away before they could notice me standing there. My legs felt weak. Once inside my bedroom, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. For several minutes, I simply stared at the floor. The nursing home comment had not been a joke. It had not been an unfortunate mistake. It had been a message, and judging by the conversation I had just overheard, it was a message based on plans that were already in motion. I looked around the room I had occupied since Richard died. Family photographs lined the dresser. A framed picture of our wedding day sat beside the lamp. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, yet nothing felt the same anymore. Somewhere in the house, my son and his wife. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Melissa's voice repeating the same sentence over and over again. The old lady going to a nursing home. By sunrise, exhaustion settled heavily across my shoulders, but something stronger had taken root beneath it. Doubt. Not doubt about what I heard. Doubt about everything I thought I knew. For years, I believed Ryan and Melissa viewed me as family. I believed that after Richard died, we had built a life based on mutual respect and support. Now I found myself wondering how much of that had been real. The next morning the house felt unusually quiet. Melissa had already left for work. Ryan was in his home office. I moved through the kitchen making coffee, studying every detail around me as though I were seeing the place for the first time. Family photographs lined the walls. Pictures from vacations, Christmas mornings, school graduations. In nearly every image, I was smiling. Looking at them now felt strange. How many of those moments had been genuine? How many had simply been convenient? Around 9 o'clock, Ryan emerged from his office carrying a coffee mug. The moment he saw me, he hesitated. That hesitation told me more than words could have. "Good morning, Mom," he said. His voice sounded careful. Too careful. "Good morning, Ryan," I replied. We stood in silence for a few seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been waiting all night. What exactly did Melissa mean during her toast yesterday? His face immediately tightened. "Mom, she was just joking." The answer arrived too quickly. People telling the truth rarely rush. I looked directly into his eyes. Was she? Ryan glanced toward the window. "I think it came out wrong." I nodded slowly. "Interesting, because it sounded very specific to me." He said nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. After a few moments, he muttered something about work and returned to his office. I remained alone in the kitchen staring into my coffee cup. For the first time in my life, I felt like a guest in my own home. Later that afternoon, Melissa returned from work carrying shopping bags. Her cheerful demeanor seemed almost rehearsed. She asked if I enjoyed my birthday. She talked about leftovers from the party. She discussed weekend plans. Not once did she mention the toast. Not once did she acknowledge the discomfort she created. Watching her move around the kitchen as though nothing had happened made me even more uneasy. That evening, while searching for a missing photo album in the upstairs hallway closet, I discovered something unexpected. Tucked behind a stack of folded blankets sat a glossy brochure. At first I assumed it was junk mail. Then I noticed a photograph of a large retirement community on the cover. My stomach tightened immediately. I pulled it free and examined the front. The words "Luxury Senior Living" were printed across the top. My pulse quickened. Slowly, I opened it. Inside were photographs of private rooms, dining halls, gardens, recreational activities, and smiling elderly residents. Someone had circled several sections with blue ink. My hands began trembling. Then I reached the final page. Written neatly across a contact form was my name, Evelyn Parker. Beneath it was my date of birth, my phone number, my medical information. I stared at the page in disbelief. This was not casual research. This was preparation. Detailed preparation. My knees felt weak. I sat down on the hallway floor and continued reading. Several handwritten notes appeared in the margins. Preferred move-in timeline. Transportation arrangements. Financial questions. Every line suggested the same thing. Conversations had already happened. Plans had already been discussed. Decisions had already been considered. And nobody had bothered to include me. I closed the brochure and simply sat there. The house around me felt strangely unfamiliar. A week earlier, I believed my future was secure. Now I was holding evidence that other people were quietly designing that future without my knowledge. A floorboard creaked nearby. Startled, I quickly slid the brochure back where I found it. Seconds later, Melissa appeared at the end of the hallway. Her eyes immediately shifted toward the closet. Then back to me. "Everything okay, Evelyn?" Her voice sounded pleasant. Too pleasant. I forced a smile. "Just looking for an old photo album." She nodded slowly. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Something passed between us then. Not words. Awareness. I think she knew I had found something. And I think she realized I knew more than I was saying. That night during dinner, conversation remained polite but strained. Ryan talked about work. Melissa discussed community events. I responded when necessary. Yet beneath every exchange, a new tension existed. The brochure remained fixed in my thoughts. After dinner, I excused myself and returned to my room. Once the door closed behind me, I sat beside the window and looked out at the backyard. The oak tree Richard planted 20 years earlier stood illuminated by the porch light. I remembered a conversation we had long ago. Richard always believed preparation mattered, not because he expected the worst from people, because he understood human nature. At the time, I laughed whenever he organized documents or labeled folders. Now, for reasons I could not fully explain, that memory suddenly felt important. As I looked around the bedroom, my eyes drifted toward an old cedar closet tucked into the corner. Richard once told me there was a small box hidden inside, a box he wanted me to keep safe. For years, I never paid much attention to it. We had time, I thought. We always believed there would be more time. Slowly, I stood and walked toward the closet. My hands rested on the wooden door. Somewhere downstairs, Ryan and Melissa continued their evening completely unaware of what I was thinking. The brochure had answered one question. They were planning something. But another question remained. How long had Richard known that one day I might need to protect myself? And as I opened the closet door and stared into the darkness beyond, I began to suspect that my late husband may have left behind more than memories. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring into the cedar closet. The scent of old wood and time drifted toward me as memories flooded back. Richard had always been organized. Every important paper had a place. Every promise had a record. Every decision had a reason. During our 47 years of marriage, I sometimes teased him about it. He would simply smile and say that one day I might appreciate his habits. Standing there on the night after my birthday, I finally understood what he meant. I reached toward the back corner of the closet where a narrow shelf sat hidden behind several old blankets. My fingers brushed against something solid, a small wooden box. My heartbeat quickened. Carefully, I pulled it forward and carried it to the bed. The box was not locked. It never had been. Richard trusted me completely. He simply trusted that I would not open it until I truly needed to. For years, I never felt the need. Now everything felt different. I lifted the lid. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a sealed envelope, and a small handwritten note resting on top. The moment I saw Richard's handwriting, my eyes filled with tears. It had been 5 years since I heard his voice, yet somehow his handwriting still felt alive. I unfolded the note. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then something has happened that made you question whether you are truly safe. I stopped breathing for a moment. Then I continued reading. Richard explained that he hoped I would never need what was inside the box. He hoped our family would remain united. He hoped love and loyalty would always be stronger than greed and convenience. But he also believed preparation was an act of love. The note continued for several pages. Every sentence sounded exactly like him. Calm, thoughtful, practical. By the time I reached the end, tears were rolling down my cheeks. Not because he expected betrayal, because he understood human nature. He knew that circumstances could change people. He knew that good intentions sometimes disappeared when money, property, or personal ambition entered the picture. Beneath the letter sat several folders labeled in his handwriting. Insurance, property records, financial accounts, family trust. My attention immediately fixed on the final folder. Family trust. I opened it carefully. Inside were copies of legal documents I had never seen before. Some of the language was complicated, but one thing became clear almost immediately. Richard had established protections years earlier. Not because he expected conflict, because he wanted to ensure that I would always have choices. I spent nearly an hour reviewing page after page. The more I read, the more confused I became. Certain sections referenced ownership interests connected to the house. Others mentioned assets that remained protected regardless of future family circumstances. Nothing suggested enormous wealth. Richard and I had never been wealthy people. But these documents suggested something important. My future was not as dependent on Ryan and Melissa as they appeared to believe. A sudden sound downstairs pulled me from my thoughts. A door closed. Then footsteps moved through the hallway. Quickly, I returned everything to the box except the original letter. Something told me I would read it many times. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. For the first time in days, I felt something besides fear. Curiosity. I needed answers. More importantly, I needed facts. During breakfast, Melissa appeared unusually cheerful. She chatted about errands, weekend plans, neighborhood news. Watching her speak so casually while knowing what I had discovered felt surreal. Ryan remained quiet. Every few minutes, I caught him studying me as though he sensed something had changed. Perhaps it had. By late morning, both of them left the house. The moment their cars disappeared down the street, I returned to the bedroom and reopened the box. This time I examined every document more carefully. Near the bottom of one folder, I found a business card attached to a folded sheet of paper. The name immediately caught my attention. Daniel Whitaker, attorney at law. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Daniel had handled several legal matters for Richard years ago. On the back of the card, Richard had written a short message. If you ever need guidance, call Daniel. He knows everything. My pulse quickened. He knows everything. I looked again at the documents scattered across the bed. For the first time since Melissa's toast, I felt the smallest spark of hope. Perhaps I was not completely alone. Perhaps Richard anticipated more than I ever realized. Before I could think further, movement outside the bedroom window caught my attention. Melissa's car. She had returned unexpectedly. Instinctively, I gathered the documents and returned them to the box. Moments later, the front door opened downstairs. I listened carefully. Instead of coming inside immediately, Melissa remained outside speaking on her phone. Curious, I moved closer to the window. Her voice drifted upward through the open air. I could not hear every word, but certain phrases reached me clearly. Timeline, availability, transition, move-in date. My stomach tightened. Then came one sentence that made my blood run cold. We need to finalize everything before she changes her mind. She. There was no doubt who she meant. I stepped back from the window. Suddenly, the brochure hidden in the closet seemed even more significant. This was no longer speculation, no longer suspicion. Plans were actively moving forward. And based on what I had just heard, those plans were further along than anyone admitted. As Melissa ended her call and walked into the house, I sat quietly beside the wooden box. Richard's letter rested in my hands. For days I felt like a confused old woman watching her life slowly slip away. Now I felt something different. Determined. Because somewhere within these papers lay the truth. And for the first time since my birthday dinner, I realized that the people making decisions about my future might not have all the information they thought they did. The following morning, I sat alone at the kitchen table long before anyone else woke up. A cup of coffee rested between my hands, growing colder with every passing minute. Outside, the early autumn sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the backyard. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. The wooden box remained hidden in my bedroom closet, and Richard's letter had not left my thoughts since I first read it. Every sentence seemed more important now than it had the day before, especially one line. Preparation is not a sign of distrust. It is a sign of responsibility. At the time he wrote those words, I doubt he imagined how much they would matter to me. Around 8 o'clock, Ryan entered the kitchen. He looked tired. The dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept well either. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. How are you doing, Mom? It was such a simple question. Under normal circumstances, I would have answered automatically. Fine. But nothing about our situation was normal anymore. I looked at him carefully. How honest do you want me to be? His expression tightened. Honest. I nodded slowly. Then I am confused, hurt, and wondering why everyone seems to know more about my future than I do. He immediately looked away. That reaction told me everything. Before he could respond, Melissa entered the kitchen carrying her phone. The conversation ended as quickly as it began. She greeted us both cheerfully and began discussing plans for the weekend as though no tension existed. Watching her perform normality was becoming increasingly difficult. By late morning, both of them left the house. The moment I heard the garage door close, I returned upstairs and retrieved the wooden box. This time, I focused on the folder labeled Family Trust. I spread the documents across my bed and read each page carefully. Legal language has never been my strength, but certain details stood out. Several assets remained protected under arrangements Richard established years earlier. More importantly, some of those protections appeared directly connected to the house itself. The more I read, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. Richard anticipated the possibility that I might one day need financial independence. Not because he expected betrayal, because he wanted to guarantee I would always have options. Near the bottom of the folder, I found another sealed envelope. Unlike the first letter, this one contained a date. 5 years ago, only weeks before Richard passed away. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter inside was shorter, but far more direct. Evelyn, if circumstances ever make you feel pressured, isolated, or manipulated, contact Daniel Whitaker immediately. He has instructions and documents that may become important. Trust him completely. I read the letter 3 times. Then I picked up the business card attached to the folder. Daniel Whitaker, attorney at law. Richard was not the type of man who exaggerated. If he left instructions this specific, there was a reason. For nearly an hour, I debated whether to call. Part of me still hoped I was misunderstanding everything. Another part knew the nursing home brochure alone justified asking questions. Finally, I picked up my phone and dialed the number. The receptionist answered after 2 rings. Whitaker Legal Associates. How may I help you? My voice felt surprisingly steady. My name is Evelyn Parker. I believe your office handled legal matters for my late husband, Richard Parker. There was a brief pause. Then the receptionist asked me to hold. Seconds later, a warm voice came onto the line. Mrs. Parker, I have been hoping you would never need to call me. My heart skipped a beat. Daniel Whitaker remembered me immediately. He sounded older than I remembered, but there was no uncertainty in his voice. We spoke for several minutes. I explained only the basics, the birthday party, the nursing home comment, the brochure, the strange behavior. He listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, the silence on the line lasted several seconds. Finally, he spoke. Evelyn, I think we should meet in person. As soon as possible. Something in his tone told me this was not a casual suggestion. We arranged an appointment for the following afternoon. After hanging up, I sat quietly on the edge of the bed. My emotions were difficult to untangle. Fear remained. So did sadness. But for the first time since my birthday, uncertainty was beginning to give way to clarity. Richard had left a trail. Not a treasure map. Not a secret fortune. A trail of information designed to protect me if I ever needed it. Later that evening, while helping clear dishes after dinner, I noticed Melissa standing near the dining room window, speaking softly on her phone. She did not realize I could hear her. Most of the conversation was too quiet to understand. Then one sentence reached me clearly. We need everything finalized before the end of the month. My stomach tightened. Finalized. The same urgency appeared again. The same timeline. The same determination. Whatever plans existed, they were moving forward quickly. Melissa ended the call and turned around. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Something shifted between us. I no longer felt confused. She no longer seemed entirely confident. Neither of us said a word. That night, as I prepared for bed, I placed Richard's letters inside my nightstand drawer. Tomorrow I would meet the man he trusted. Tomorrow I might finally learn why my husband spent years preparing documents he hoped I would never need. And as I switched off the lamp beside my bed, one thought stayed with me. Melissa believed she was controlling the future. What she did not know was that Richard had been quietly protecting mine for years. The next afternoon, I drove across town to Daniel Whitaker's office with a knot in my stomach. The building sat on a quiet corner lined with maple trees that had begun turning shades of gold and red. Everything about the neighborhood felt calm, which stood in sharp contrast to the thoughts racing through my mind. I arrived 15 minutes early and spent most of that time sitting in my car staring at Richard's business card. I kept thinking about the phrase he had written on the back. He knows everything. Richard was not a dramatic man. He chose his words carefully. If he trusted Daniel that much, there was a reason. When I finally entered the office, the receptionist greeted me warmly and escorted me to a conference room. A few moments later, Daniel walked in carrying a thick file. His hair was grayer than I remembered, but his expression remained steady and reassuring. Evelyn, it is good to see you again, he said as he shook my hand. I wish the circumstances were different. So do I replied. We sat down across from one another. For a few minutes, he asked questions about my health, my living situation, and what had happened since my birthday. I explained everything. Melissa's toast, the brochure, the conversations I overheard, Ryan's strange behavior. Daniel listened without interruption. When I finished, he opened the file in front of him and slowly removed several documents. Richard came to see me about 7 years ago, he began. At the time, nothing was wrong. In fact, he spoke very highly of Ryan and Melissa. That surprised me. If he trusted them, why all of this preparation? Daniel nodded as though he expected the question. Because Richard understood something important. Good people can make bad decisions when circumstances change. He wanted to protect you without creating conflict. I sat quietly as he slid the first document across the table. The pages looked familiar. They contained information similar to what I had already found in the wooden box. But there was more. Much more. Daniel pointed to several highlighted sections. Years ago, when Ryan and Melissa encountered financial difficulties, Richard provided significant assistance. I remember that time clearly. They nearly lost the house after a failed business investment. Richard and I stepped in because they were family. We never discussed details afterward. Daniel adjusted his glasses. That is because Richard intentionally handled the matter in a specific way. The assistance was not structured as a gift. It was protected through legal agreements. My heartbeat quickened. Protected how? Daniel turned another page. Through ownership interests and trust provisions designed to ensure your long-term security. I stared at the document. For several seconds, I could not speak. Are you telling me that the house is not entirely theirs? Daniel met my eyes. I am telling you that the situation is far more complicated than they appear to believe. A strange mixture of relief and confusion washed over me. For weeks, I felt powerless, disposable, dependent. Suddenly, that picture looked very different. Daniel continued reviewing the paperwork. Richard was especially concerned about one possibility. That after his passing, someone might attempt to make major decisions affecting your future without your informed consent. I remembered the nursing home brochure immediately. The carefully filled out forms. The planned timeline. The phone conversations. My stomach tightened. Did Richard specifically mention that possibility? Not a nursing home, Daniel answered. But he believed you should always maintain control over where and how you lived. That was extremely important to him. My eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, people moved along the sidewalk carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. Ordinary lives. Ordinary afternoons. Meanwhile, everything I thought I understood about my own situation was changing. Daniel opened another folder. There is something else you need to know. His tone became more serious. Several months ago, our office received inquiries related to property records connected to your home. My pulse quickened again. Inquiries from who? He hesitated briefly. Melissa. The room seemed to grow very quiet. She contacted your office. Indirectly. Through professionals gathering information. At the time, nothing appeared improper. However, certain questions suggested a strong interest in understanding what rights remained connected to the property. I immediately understood why that mattered. Melissa was researching, planning, preparing. She knew enough to be concerned, even if she did not know everything. Daniel folded his hands. Evelyn, I cannot tell you exactly what Melissa believed. But based on the timing, it appears she was attempting to determine whether any obstacles existed to future financial decisions involving the property, such as selling it. Daniel nodded. Among other possibilities. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he handed me one final document. Richard instructed me to give you this only if circumstances required it. I carefully unfolded the paper. It was another letter, shorter than the others, more personal. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then life has become more complicated than either of us hoped. Remember this. You are stronger than you think. Never allow anyone to convince you that age makes you powerless. Love your family. Forgive when appropriate. But never surrender your dignity. By the time I reached the final sentence, tears blurred the words. Daniel quietly handed me a tissue. Richard knew you very well, he said softly. I laughed through my tears. Yes, he did. When our meeting finally ended, I walked back to my car carrying copies of several documents and a completely different understanding of my future. For the first time since my birthday, I no longer felt trapped. Questions remained. Many questions. But one thing had become absolutely clear. Melissa was hiding something. And whatever she believed she was preparing for, she did not know the full story. As I started the engine and prepared to drive home, my phone buzzed with an incoming message. The sender's name made my heart skip a beat. Melissa. The message contained only 6 words. We need to talk tonight. The message remained on my phone screen the entire drive home. We need to talk tonight. 6 simple words. Yet after everything that had happened, they carried far more weight than Melissa probably intended. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was beginning to set. The house looked exactly as it always had. The neatly trimmed lawn, the flower beds along the front walk, the porch light waiting to come on as evening approached. To anyone passing by, it looked like the home of a happy family. I sat in my car for a moment before going inside. For the first time since my birthday, I felt something new. Confidence. Not because I had all the answers, because I finally knew I was not powerless. Richard had made sure of that. When I entered the house, Melissa was waiting in the kitchen. Ryan sat at the table beside her. The atmosphere immediately felt different. Serious, careful, almost rehearsed. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. In fact, it seemed as though they had been waiting for my arrival. I set my purse down and took a seat across from them. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Melissa cleared her throat. "Evelyn, there are some things we need to discuss." Her voice sounded measured and controlled. I folded my hands in front of me. "Then let us discuss them." Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Melissa glanced at him before continuing. "We have been thinking about the future." I nearly smiled. The future again. That word appeared constantly lately. Everyone seemed interested in my future except me. Melissa continued speaking. "The house is becoming difficult to manage. Expenses are increasing. Everyone is busy. We have responsibilities." I listened quietly. The explanation sounded familiar. Too familiar. Like something practiced in advance. Then she said the words I had expected. "We believe a senior living community could provide more support and comfort for you." There it was. No joke this time. No hidden implication. Direct and clear. I looked at Ryan. He immediately lowered his eyes. My heart ached at the sight. He was 43 years old and still avoiding difficult conversations. "How long have you been discussing this?" Melissa answered before Ryan could speak. "Several months." The honesty surprised me. Several months. During those months, family dinners continued. Holidays continued. Conversations continued. All while plans were developing behind my back. I remained calm. "Have either of you considered asking what I want?" Silence filled the kitchen. Melissa opened her mouth, but did not immediately answer. Ryan finally spoke. "Mom, we were trying to do what was best." I turned toward him. "Best for whom?" He had no response. The question lingered in the room unanswered. Melissa leaned forward. "Evelyn, this is not about pushing you away. It is about making sure you are taken care of." Her words sounded reasonable. That was what made them dangerous. Sometimes the most painful decisions arrive wrapped in good intentions. I looked directly at her. Then why was my information already filled out on nursing home paperwork? The color immediately drained from her face. For the first time that evening, she looked genuinely caught off guard. Ryan stared at her. "What paperwork?" Melissa looked from him to me and back again. Nobody spoke. The silence became almost unbearable. Finally, I continued. "The brochure hidden in the hallway closet. The application information. The notes about move-in dates." Ryan slowly turned toward his wife. His expression changed completely. "Melissa, what is she talking about?" Melissa's confidence began slipping. "It was only preliminary research. Nothing final." Ryan frowned. "You never told me about applications." I watched the exchange carefully. This was important. For days I assumed they were working together. Now I was no longer certain. Melissa attempted to explain. "I was trying to stay organized. I wanted options available." Ryan shook his head slowly. "Why would you fill out forms before talking to Mom?" She did not answer immediately. That answer told me more than any explanation could have. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Melissa knew more than Ryan. Much more. She had researched facilities, contacted administrators, gathered information, created timelines. Ryan knew about the general idea, but not the details. The realization visibly unsettled him. By the end of the discussion, confusion had replaced certainty on his face. Eventually, Melissa stood and walked toward the sink. Her composure was fading. I remained seated. There was one question I needed answered. "Melissa." She turned slowly. "Why the rush?" The question seemed to strike a nerve. Her expression hardened briefly before softening again. "There is no rush." "Yes, there is. I heard your phone calls. I found your notes. Everything points to urgency." "Why?" Once again, silence filled the room. Then Ryan spoke quietly. "Melissa, why?" For several moments, she stared out the kitchen window into the darkening backyard. Finally, she exhaled. "We have been considering selling the house." My heart sank. Not because of the house itself, because everything suddenly made sense. The timelines, the planning, the pressure, the urgency. Ryan looked stunned. Selling it. You said we were only exploring possibilities. Melissa crossed her arms. We were. Then why am I hearing about this now? The tension between them became impossible to ignore. I sat quietly, watching pieces of a larger picture finally emerge. Melissa wanted freedom, flexibility, a fresh start. The house represented an asset, an opportunity, and my presence complicated those plans. She was not necessarily trying to be cruel, but she had become so focused on her destination that she stopped seeing the people standing in the way. By the time the conversation ended, nobody felt victorious. Nobody felt satisfied. Ryan looked exhausted. Melissa looked frustrated. I felt strangely calm. As I stood to leave the kitchen, Ryan called after me. Mom. I turned. He looked genuinely troubled. Is there something you are not telling us? For a brief moment, I thought about Daniel, about Richard's documents, about the protections neither of them knew existed. Then I simply smiled. Yes, Ryan, there is. And for the first time since my birthday, I realized that the moment of truth might be arriving sooner than any of us expected. The next morning felt different from every morning that came before it. For days, I had been reacting to events as they unfolded. Now I finally possessed information that others did not. More importantly, I possessed patience. Richard always believed patience revealed character. Given enough time, people eventually showed who they truly were. As I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, I found myself thinking about that lesson. The air felt cool. Fallen leaves scattered across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed softly. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet inside the house, something had shifted. Ryan barely spoke during breakfast. Melissa appeared distracted. Neither of them mentioned our conversation from the previous night, but tension lingered beneath every exchange. I could see it in the way Ryan studied his wife when he thought nobody was watching. I could hear it in the pauses between their words. Questions had been planted, and once questions take root, certainty becomes difficult to maintain. Around mid-morning, Ryan knocked gently on my bedroom door. When I invited him inside, he closed the door behind him and sat across from me. For several moments, he simply looked at his hands. Then he spoke. Mom, I need to ask you something. I nodded. Go ahead. He exhaled slowly. Have Melissa and I made you feel unwanted? The question caught me by surprise. Not because I did not know the answer, because it was the first truly honest question he had asked since all of this began. I considered my words carefully. Ryan, being unwanted and being treated like an inconvenience are not always the same thing. His face tightened. I never wanted you to feel either one. I believe you. The problem is that wanting something and allowing something are different things. He lowered his eyes. For the first time, I saw genuine regret. Not defensiveness. Not excuses. Regret. Then he asked another question. What is it that you are not telling us? I thought about Daniel. About Richard's letters. About the documents waiting safely in my closet. I could have revealed everything right then. Instead, I simply said, your father prepared more carefully than any of us realized. Ryan frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means there are things you should learn before anyone makes decisions about this family. He stared at me for a moment before nodding slowly. Surprisingly, he did not push further. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Daniel. He wanted to update me on several details he had reviewed after our meeting. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes. Some of the information was technical, involving legal arrangements and property records. But one fact stood above everything else. Certain protections Richard established remained fully enforceable. Nobody could simply bypass them. Nobody could quietly remove me from decisions affecting my future. After ending the call, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Not because I wanted conflict, because I finally understood the truth. That evening, something unexpected happened. Ryan came home carrying several old storage boxes from the garage. He placed them on the dining room table and began sorting through them. Curious, I joined him. Family photographs, tax records, holiday decorations, years of memories. Then he found an old folder labeled home financing. His expression immediately changed. What is it? He handed me several pages. The documents contained records from the financial crisis Daniel had described. Ryan studied them carefully. His confusion gradually deepened. Mom, why is Dad's name on all of this? I said nothing. He continued reading. Then came another page. Then another. The room grew quiet. Melissa entered halfway through and immediately noticed the tension. What is going on? Ryan looked up. Did you know Dad helped save this house? Melissa froze. Her reaction lasted only a second, but it was enough. Ryan noticed it too. You knew. Melissa crossed her arms. I knew he helped. Ryan shook his head. No, you knew more than that. The conversation that followed was not loud. In many ways, that made it more powerful. Nobody shouted. Nobody stormed out. Instead, years of assumptions began unraveling one piece at a time. Ryan asked questions. Melissa struggled to answer some of them. The certainty she once carried seemed to be slipping away. Eventually, Ryan stood and walked toward the living room window. He remained there for several minutes, staring into the darkness outside. When he finally turned around, his voice sounded different. Older somehow. More thoughtful. Why did nobody tell me any of this? I looked at him carefully. Because your father never wanted you to feel indebted. Silence followed. Then Ryan said something that surprised everyone. I think Dad was protecting more than the house. Nobody responded. Yet deep down, we all knew he was right. Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt unusually quiet. I glanced toward Richard's favorite chair. For years, I associated that chair with loss. Tonight it reminded me of something else. Foresight. He saw possibilities others ignored. He understood that love sometimes requires preparation. As I prepared to head upstairs, my phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Ryan. Even though he was only one floor away, he chose to send a text. The message contained a single sentence. Mom, I think I finally understand why Dad left those documents behind. I stared at the words for a long moment. Then I looked toward the staircase leading to the bedrooms above. The truth was no longer hidden. It was moving. Slowly. Relentlessly. And for the first time since my birthday, I realized the next family dinner might change everything. The family dinner took place 3 nights later. If someone had walked into the house without knowing our history, they might have mistaken it for an ordinary gathering. The dining room table was set with care. Candles glowed softly in the center. Plates were arranged neatly beside folded napkins. The aroma of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables drifted from the kitchen. Yet beneath the appearance of normality, everyone carried something different into that room. Ryan carried questions. Melissa carried uncertainty. I carried the truth. By the time everyone sat down, conversation remained polite but cautious. We discussed work, the grandchildren, the weather, local events. Nobody mentioned nursing homes. Nobody mentioned property records. Nobody mentioned Richard. It felt as though we were all waiting for the same moment to arrive. Eventually it did. Halfway through dinner, Ryan placed his fork down and looked directly at Melissa. The room immediately became quiet. There was something I need to ask you, he said. Melissa looked up from her plate. About what? About the house. Her expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough for everyone to notice. Ryan continued. How long have you been planning to sell it? Several seconds passed before she answered. We discussed possibilities. That is not what I asked. His voice remained calm. How long? Melissa glanced toward me before returning her attention to Ryan. About a year. The answer landed heavily on the table. A year. During that year there had been holidays, birthdays, family vacations, and countless dinners. An entire year of plans. Developing while I remained completely unaware. Ryan slowly nodded. Then he asked another question. And when exactly were you planning to tell Mom? Melissa looked down. I was waiting for the right time. The response sounded weak even to her own ears. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then I spoke. The right time usually comes before paperwork is completed. Melissa closed her eyes briefly. I knew immediately she understood what I meant. The brochure. The applications. The timelines. The room felt smaller by the second. Finally, she looked directly at me. Evelyn, I never wanted to hurt you. I studied her carefully. For the first time since my birthday, she looked genuinely exhausted. Not angry. Not defensive. Tired. The weight of months of secrecy was beginning to show. Then why did you never ask me what I wanted? Her eyes lowered. Because I thought I already knew the answer. The honesty surprised everyone, including her. Ryan leaned back in his chair. You thought you knew the answer. She nodded slowly. I thought you would never leave willingly. I thought every conversation would become a fight. I thought it would be easier if everything was already arranged. Easier. The word echoed through my mind. So many painful decisions begin with that word. Easier. Easier for who? Easier for what? Ryan stared at the table. Then he looked at me. Mom, I owe you an apology. His voice carried genuine emotion. Not because of what happened on my birthday. Because I ignored things I should have questioned long ago. I felt my chest tighten. Hearing those words from my son mattered more than I expected. I nodded quietly. Thank you. The conversation could have ended there. Perhaps it should have. But something told me the time had come. Slowly, I stood from my chair. Then I walked into the living room and returned carrying a folder. Richard's folder. I placed it gently on the dining room table. Melissa's eyes immediately fixed on it. Ryan looked confused. What is that? I opened the folder and removed several documents. Your father spent years preparing these. Neither of them spoke. I continued. He never wanted conflict. He never wanted anyone to feel controlled. But he believed. Preparation was an act of love. Ryan stared at the pages as I slid them toward him. For several minutes, he read silently. His expression changed repeatedly. Confusion, surprise, understanding, then finally disbelief. Melissa leaned forward to see the documents herself. The color slowly drained from her face. Richard had protected my future more thoroughly than either of them realized. Certain decisions required my participation. Certain protections remained active. Certain assumptions were simply wrong. Nobody had complete control. Not Ryan. Not Melissa. Not anyone except the person Richard intended to protect. Me. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I could remember. Finally, Melissa spoke. I did not know. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I believe you. She looked up, surprised by my response. I do. I believe you knew enough to worry, but not enough to understand. Tears formed in her eyes. Everything I did was supposed to help our future. I nodded slowly. That may be true, but somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as part of that future. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The truth simply settled into the room. Ryan reached for Melissa's hand. To her credit, she did not pull away. For the first time, they both seemed to understand the same thing. This was never really about money, or property, or retirement plans. It was about respect, dignity, family, the things that become invisible when people focus too heavily on what comes next. Eventually, Ryan looked toward me. What happens now? I smiled softly. The answer came easier than expected. Now we stop making plans for each other and start having honest conversations. A small laugh escaped Ryan despite everything. That sounds like something Dad would say. It does, I admitted, because he taught me well. By the time dinner ended, nothing had been fully resolved. Real healing never happens in a single evening. But something important had changed. Secrets no longer controlled the room. Assumptions no longer controlled the future. As everyone helped clear dishes and extinguish candles, I looked around the dining room that had witnessed so much pain over the previous weeks. The birthday humiliation, the hidden plans, the lies of omission. Yet tonight it witnessed something else. Accountability. And as I watched Melissa quietly wipe tears from her eyes while Ryan stood beside her, I realized that the final chapter of this story would not be about revenge. It would be about choice. For the first time in a very long time, that choice belonged entirely to me. The weeks that followed were some of the most important weeks of my life. Not because dramatic events continued happening. In fact, quite the opposite. The chaos slowly disappeared. The secrets had been exposed. The misunderstandings had been dragged into the light. What remained was something far more difficult than conflict. Honesty. Real honesty. The kind families often avoid because it forces people to examine themselves. After the dinner where everything finally came out, nobody rushed to make decisions. The nursing home discussions stopped completely. The house was no longer mentioned as a quick financial solution. For the first time in months, conversations happened openly. Ryan spent several evenings reviewing documents with Daniel Whitaker. The more he learned about what Richard had arranged years earlier, the quieter he became. One afternoon, he sat beside me on the back porch, staring across the yard at the oak tree his father planted when he was a teenager. I should have paid more attention to Dad, he said softly. I smiled. That realization comes to most people eventually. He laughed quietly. I just wish it had come sooner. So did I? Yet there was no anger in my voice. Only truth. We sat there together for several minutes. The same porch where Richard and I once planned family vacations. The same porch where I drank coffee every morning after he passed away. Life has a strange way of bringing people back to the places where important lessons begin. As for Melissa, the changes in her were harder to describe but impossible to miss. She no longer acted like someone managing a plan. She acted like someone questioning one. Several times she attempted to apologize. The first few conversations felt awkward. Apologies often do, especially when they arrive after deep hurt. One evening, she joined me in the kitchen while I prepared dinner. For several minutes, she simply stood beside the counter. Then she finally spoke. "I keep thinking about that birthday toast." I continued slicing vegetables without looking up. "So do I." Her voice cracked slightly. "Every time I remember it, I hear how cruel it sounded." I set the knife down and turned toward her. "Melissa, people reveal themselves in moments they believe are harmless. That is what makes those moments important." Tears filled her eyes. I never wanted to become that person. I believed her, not because she was innocent, because regret was finally replacing justification. There is a difference. Over time, the tension inside the house gradually eased. But something else happened as well. I began thinking seriously about my own future. Not the future other people wanted for me. My future, the one Richard spent years protecting. One morning, I drove to a small lakeside community about 30 miles away. Richard and I visited the area years earlier and always loved it. The town was quiet. The people were friendly. There were walking paths near the water and small shops along the main street. Most importantly, it felt peaceful. I spent the afternoon exploring. By the time I returned home, a decision had already formed in my mind. A week later, I shared that decision with Ryan and Melissa. We sat together in the living room, the same room where countless family conversations had taken place. I folded my hands and smiled. "I have decided what comes next." Both of them immediately paid attention. Ryan looked nervous. Melissa looked worried. "I am not moving into a nursing home." Relief appeared on both of their faces instantly. Then I continued. "But I am not staying here forever either." Now confusion replaced relief. I explained my plans. A small cottage near the lake. Independent living. A place that belonged to me. A place chosen by me. Ryan stared at me for several seconds before smiling. "Mom, that sounds exactly like something Dad would have loved." "I think so too." Melissa looked surprised. "You want to live alone?" I nodded. "I want to live independently." "There is a difference." Nobody argued. Nobody tried to stop me. For the first time, everyone understood that the decision belonged to me. Several months later, I stood on the porch of my new cottage watching the sunset reflect across the water. The house was modest. One bedroom, a small garden, a white rocking chair near the front door. Nothing extravagant. Yet every inch of it represented something priceless. Choice. The rose bushes I planted were beginning to bloom. Wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere nearby, children laughed as they rode bicycles down the street. Life felt peaceful again. Ryan visited often. So did the grandchildren. Even Melissa came by from time to time. Our relationship would never be exactly what it once was. Some wounds leave permanent reminders. But surprisingly, healing still happened. Not because anyone forgot the past, because everyone finally learned from it. One evening, nearly a year after my 70th birthday, the entire family gathered at my cottage for dinner. As we sat together on the porch, watching the sun disappear beyond the lake, I thought about how different everything felt. The woman who sat at the head of that birthday table had believed her life was shrinking. She believed she was becoming a burden. She believed other people would decide where her story ended. She was wrong. Very wrong. Age had not taken away my voice. Grief had not taken away my strength. Betrayal had not taken away my dignity. If anything, those experiences revealed qualities I forgot I possessed. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone beneath the stars. The air smelled faintly of roses. Richard's final letter rested inside a drawer near the front door. I no longer needed to read it every day. Its lessons had already become part of me. As I looked across the quiet lake, one final thought crossed my mind. The greatest gift Richard ever gave me was not money, not property, not legal protection. It was the reminder that no matter how old we become, we still deserve the right to choose our own future. And this time, that future belonged entirely to me.